this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 150 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, Bracket 2, and the motion adopted on Thursday, June 13, 2024, the committee is meeting to discuss the changes to capital gains and corresponding measures announced in Budget 2024. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all members and other persons in the room, participants, to consult the cards on the table. For guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents, please take note of the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Only use a black-approved earpiece. The former gray earpieces must no longer be used. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. When you're not using your earpiece, place it face down, the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. Thank you for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to Standing Order 15.1. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informed the committee that all witnesses have been completed and required the connection tests in advance of the meeting and are ready to go. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the members and witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your understanding in this regard. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I'd like to now welcome our witnesses. So with us today, and we do have a full house. I can see here, I think we got six witnesses that are before us. As an individual, we have a professor from Chaire en Fiscalité et en Finances Publiques, Université de Québec, de Sherbrooke. My apologies. Professor Luc Godbout. As an individual, who's a plumber and business owner, we have Larry Stefanik, who's joined us. From the Canadian Labour Congress, we have President Bia Brusque. Welcome, Madam President. And from also joining President Brusque, we have Senior Economist D.T. Cochrane. Welcome. From Canadians for Tax Fairness, researcher and policy analyst, we have Silas Shreb, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name. And from Center for Future Work, economist and director, and no stranger to this committee, we have Jim Stanford joining us. From the Wheat Growers Association, we have its president, Gunter Jochum, I believe is how to pronounce it, but if I get that wrong, please excuse that. And now we are going to hear from the individuals, and we're going to start with Professor Godbout, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to go quite quickly. The increase in capital gains inclusion rate announced in Budget 2024 takes effect 1 week from today, June 25th. For individuals, the change applies only to the portion of capital gains exceeding $250,000 annually. For corporations and trusts, at 66.67% inclusion rate increase applies to the entire realized capital gain. The question is not so much whether capital gains tax reform makes sense in the long run, but the relative benefits of the announced changes outweigh drawbacks, and implementation of that should be favored. That said, let's take a step back to better assess the situation. This is not the first time that capital gains inclusion rate has been raised, nor is it the first time that it has been done in a very short term. So how are the changes made? So not going back too far, in 1971, the bill leading to capital gains taxation was tabled almost 200 days before its implementation, January 1st, in 1979. In 88, the announcement was made in June 87 with the tabling of a white paper 6 months in advance. But they waited 2 weeks before implementing it, and also the bills that were vehicles for it came months afterwards. That isn't like the present situation. However, it was only a few days before the change came into effect in the Notice of Ways and Means motion that was tabled in this budget. If it had had a longer lead time, it would have allowed taxpayers to better plan their affairs. You could say it's similar to the current situation. Let me now turn to a few issues. Clearly, in view of the fact that the Ways and Means motion was only tabled last week, I can say that it does in itself pose a difficulty. But I have identified 4 other issues. For the first issue is flexibility. It would be possible to offer taxpayers a choice to realize capital gains on paper before June 25th without any actual disposition via deemed deposit to oneself. This proposal has been taken up by the Committee on Taxation of the Canadian Bar Association and the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, but now it's all too late. That possibility would have given taxpayers more time, considering that the election would be filed and transmitted to the tax authorities when the 2024 tax return is filed. That would bring us to early 2025 for the integration of the change. That would apply to rules after June 25. But they would also give a greater chance of fairness to the taxpayers by pushing it further than June 25th. So I think that there would be some advantage in offering a choice like that. Now, here's the second issue, an unintended retroactive effect. Having analyzed the Notice of Ways and Means motion with the tax professionals from the Association Planification Fiscale et Financière in Quebec, I wish to draw your attention to this point. There is a potential of unfair and undoubtedly unintended situation resulting from the manner in which the capital dividend account will be calculated for corporations realizing capital gains during their taxation year, including June 25. I hope that this possible anomaly will be eliminated. The third thing is this. It undermines the principle of integration. By granting $250,000 per year in protection to individuals, a first capital gains, since capital gains have been taxed, we have created an issue of overtaxation. I'm saying that corporations should be offered I'm not saying, rather, that corporations should be offered a $250,000 protection, but I'm pointing out that there is a lack of equality here with respect to the principle of integration. And finally, without saying, there is a problem with indexing and the protection ceiling of a $250,000. That should be indexed, I would think. On that point, I will conclude. Thank you so much, Professor Godbout.
Individual, we have Mr. Stefanik, please. Mr. Stefanik, you may commence.
Okay. Thank you. Hello, my name is Larry Stefanik. I'm 50 years of age, working as a plumber and a business owner in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thanks for allowing me to be a witness at this committee. I do not reside in their Liberal riding currently. However, I did reach out to the elected Liberals in Manitoba and my elected MP, Marty Morantz. Marty returned my call, and although did not promise I would be a witness, he directed me to this forum to share my thoughts. Thanks very much. Nice meeting you, Marty. I see Terry Duguid is online, which is great because he's a Manitoba Liberal, and hopefully I can talk to him sometime after this meeting. I'm having a hard time understanding why the current capital gains tax is being increased. I started my career in 1992 at the age of 19 as an apprentice plumber working in BC. I was a journey person by 1996 and continued to work and evolve into a supervisor and a manager of a large company until relocating to Manitoba in 2003. Once in Winnipeg, I found employment at a small 6-person service company that I ended up purchasing in 2010. Since then, we have slowly grown to currently employ and support 20 people and their families. Being a worker in the private sector all my life, I soon realized two main things. The harder I work, the better future I would have. Nobody is helping me and my family, so you'd better figure out things for yourself, including savings and investments. Part of this future pension investment by design was to look at the current tax implications in order for me to be financially safe into my retirement. This was not without risk. I had to purchase a business, gain employees, manage my finances, and balance a family. I have been lucky enough to align myself with professionals smarter than me to design a structure of investment so I can create my own pension plan. I understand we all have to pay our share. And I could live with the 50% taxable gain structure, but now I hear it's going up to 66%, and for no reason other than the government needs more money. I'm just a regular everyday person who happens to be a plumber running a business trying to live a good life. Why am I being penalized for hard work? I just do not understand how the current Liberal government got so out of touch with the people. I sit as a board member on the Mechanical Contractors Association of Manitoba. I also belong to a local entrepreneurs group that there's chat around the table. They just don't realize they just can't realize how the government just doesn't realize how we're not rich people. I'm a small, hardworking business owner just living next door. I have to ask the question to myself, why did I work so hard? Why did I risk it all to buy a business? Why didn't I stay a worker, a sole proprietor? That way I would be somehow treated differently. What would be the incentive going forward to the younger generation? If I was a coach or a mentor to a younger, up-and-coming generation, I would have to say, work harder and you can pay more taxes because the government isn't smart enough to make things more efficient, trim waste, and self-innovate. You should look elsewhere to make sure you're living in a place that respects your hard work and a government that realizes honest days pay for honest days work. Look, at the end of the day, I really think the people we elected should rethink this decision and roll it back. I am frustrated. I feel this is a quick shoot at the hip, no thought for regular everyday people like myself. Thank you for listening. I really hope this makes a difference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stefanik. And now we're going to hear from the Canadian Labour Congress and President Bruce, please.
Thank you so much, Chair and committee members. My name is Bea Brusk. I'm the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. The CLC represents national and international unions with more than 3 million members from coast to coast to coast and virtually every sector and industry in this country. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on behalf of this and to let you know that the CLC strongly supports the government's decision to more fairly tax capital gains. Most Canadians would assume that a dollar of income is a dollar of income, whether you earned it at a job or through a productive investment. But that's not the case when it comes to taxes. When you earn your income by flipping burgers, 100% of that income is taxable. But when you earn your income by flipping stocks, only 50% of that income is taxable. We don't think, quite frankly, that that's fair. How can anyone justify that a dollar earned through your hard work should be taxed at a higher rate than a dollar reaped through ownership and investments. Let's look at a real-life example. My first job was at a grocery store. In 2020, in the toughest days of the pandemic, before workers even knew what they were dealing with, we're having to go to work at grocery stores so that we could keep on eating, while many of us had the opportunity to work from home. Those grateful grocery store workers who we are grateful for, bravely working on those front lines, for a few months in 2020, they got an extra $2 per hour in hero pay. Every single cent of that dollar of hero pay was taxed. That same year, a Canadian billionaire bought and sold shares in one of our country's largest forestry companies, netting capital gains of more than $9 million. Only half of that windfall was taxable. That billionaire pocketed $4.5 million tax-free. That's $4.5 million in tax-free capital gains. That's more money than the average worker will see in their lifetime. When we put ourselves in the shoes of the average working person for a minute, we have to understand that that is not fair. Canadians work hard and they pay taxes on their earnings. And those taxes that come off our paychecks, they support the schools for our kids, healthcare for ourselves and our loved ones, roads and public transit, parks, libraries, and every other vital public service that we rely upon. Working people want and need strong, good quality public services. We deserve safe, healthy, and vibrant communities. And we are very much prepared to do our part to support that. What we insist on, however, is that everyone pays their fair share. That income would be treated as income whether you're taxing a worker flipping burgers for a living or a CEO flipping stocks to make millions more. Over the past few years, working people in Canada have struggled to keep up with the rising cost of living, and they know perfectly well that not everybody else is struggling as well. Canadians can see corporate CEOs and wealthy investors profiting from price gouging, and it's extremely frustrating to know that CEOs are ripping off ordinary people while getting preferential tax treatment on top of it. To know that our tax system taxes capital gains more lightly than workers' wages is infuriating. For many workers, the unfairness in the tax system adds insult to injury. Opponents of this important but modest tax change are trying to distract with stories about family farms and family doctors. Make no mistake that the vast majority of untaxed capital gains are collected by people like the billionaire that I mentioned earlier. Canadians know that the rich do not pay their fair share of taxes, and the data proves that. A recent study by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives shows that once all forms of income and taxes are accounted for, those receiving the top 1% of income in this country pay a lower tax rate than those in the bottom 99%. The treatment of capital gains is an important reason for that unfair outcome. And for working people, it's very obvious that we need fair tax rules. Those that have the means need to pay their fair share. Fair taxes for ultra-wealthy are essential for making life more affordable for everyone else. And that's why we support the changes to the capital gains inclusion rate. I urge all parliamentarians to ask themselves a simple question. Do you think it's fair that a worker flipping burgers is taxed on 100% of his or her income, while a CEO making millions from flipping stocks is taxed on only 50% of that income? If you don't think it's fair, then you need to support the small measure of tax fairness. If you do think it's fair, then please do not tell me that you are on the side of working Canadians. Thank you, and we'd be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you, Ms. Brusk. And now we'll hear from the Canadians for Tax Fairness, Silas Shurev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Canadians for Tax Fairness welcomes this important step to make our tax system more fair. These changes to capital gains taxation will lessen inequality and raise revenue that can be used to fund important public services, new affordable housing, and a just transition. As you're all aware, currently only 50% of capital gains is subject to income tax, while in contrast, 100% of income from employment is taxable. As the Carter Commission noted, this differential taxation leads to, quote, an enormous incentive for the taxpayer to try to transform income gains into capital gains, unquote. This creates uncertainty for taxpayers and inequities in the tax system. This measure would be a step towards closing this loophole. Who currently benefits from the exclusion of 50% of capital gains from taxation? According to data from the Longitudinal Administrative Data Bank, over half of personal capital gains accrue to the top 1% of market income earners each year, and over 1/4 of capital gains accrue to the top 0.1%. This means that the top 1% of income earners benefit over 250 times more from the current reduced inclusion rate on capital gains than the average Canadian. As Ms. Bruce mentioned, a recent report we co-authored with the CCPA showed that when all taxes are taken into account, including sales taxes, these top earners have the lowest tax burden of all Canadians, in part due to this capital gains exemption. This measure also affects the inclusion rate on corporate capital gains, which will be increased to 2/3, and this measure will largely affect the largest corporations. Among non-financial industries, real estate corporations earn the most capital gains. This was over $23 billion in 2022. And so this measure will reduce the incentive for large firms, such as real estate firms, to use their income for passive investments, incentivizing instead investments in new jobs, buildings, machinery, and equipment. Of course, this measure is not new in Canadian history. From 1988 through 2000, the capital gains inclusion rate was at least 2/3, and for most of this period, it was actually 75%. In contrast to concerns being raised that raising the rate could decrease productivity, there was no drop-off in productivity or business investment during this previous period with a higher capital gains inclusion rate. In fact, relative to the early 80s, business investment actually increased during the period with a higher capital gains inclusion rate. Moreover, a recent report showed that rates of labor productivity growth, which are the subject of much discussion today, were higher during the 1990s than they are today, under the lower capital gains inclusion rate. That's not to say that this change is going to increase investment or productivity, just that there's little relation between capital gains rates, tax rates, business investment, and labor productivity. On the other hand, we know that the revenue raised through this measure can be used to fund much needed public investments in housing and a just transition. Award-winning economist Mariana Mazzucato has convincingly shown over the past decade that targeted mission-driven public investment in sectors like renewable energy actually incentivizes private investment in the same sectors. This measure will allow us to democratically decide how and where to direct these much-needed investments. We also know that this measure will, at least to a limited extent, work to combat inequality, income inequality, given its targeted nature at top earners. Combating inequality is an important end in and of itself. There is even evidence that income inequality is linked to lower productivity, since low wages can make workers unmotivated. Moreover, decades of research have shown that across countries, higher inequality is correlated with lower life expectancy, higher homicide rates, and more school bullying, among other negative outcomes. We need to remember that the economy is just one part of the larger society we live in. More work needs to be done to address income inequality in Canada and ensure that resources are more equitably distributed, not only through the tax system, but through measures that affect the pre-tax income distribution. However, this change to capital gains taxation is one small step towards improving tax fairness and reducing inequality without a discernible effect on investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shureb. And now we'll go to Center for Future Work, and Mr. Jim Stanford, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and other members. The 2024 federal budget had three noteworthy features, in my view. First, it allocated modest new resources to several important initiatives, including the school lunch program, affordable housing measures, the rollout of the dental care program, and the new disability benefit. Second, the budget reaffirmed its commitment to previously stated fiscal targets, expressed in terms of a falling ratio of debt to GDP. Third, in order to make those first two add up, the budget also contains some revenue measures, most important the capital gains reforms we're discussing today. I mention this because it's as important in my view to consider what the new fiscal resources are being used for as to consider how they are raised. Those new programs will make Canada a bit fairer and healthier, and the fact that they will be funded with new revenues collected primarily from high-income Canadians by narrowing a lucrative and unfair tax loophole makes this combination of tax reform and the new programs the revenue will be used for a double-barreled boost for fairness in Canada. From my perspective as an economist, let me briefly highlight two important aspects of the capital gains reform. First, the very unequal distribution of the gains and associated tax savings. Second, the lack of connection between capital gains taxation and business capital spending. First, there is no other tax loophole more closely targeted at high-income Canadians than the partial inclusion of capital gains. In 2021, latest year of Revenue Canada data, 61% of taxable capital gains were claimed by Canadians with total income over $250,000 that year. That group makes up only 1.5% of tax filers, yet claimed 61% of all the taxable capital gains, and an even larger share of the tax benefits from partial inclusion, since they receive higher marginal tax savings than other Canadians. 56% of that group, high-income tax filers, reported capital gains, on average $180,000 each. That was just the taxable part. In contrast, 7/8 of tax filers reported income below $100,000 that year. Less than 10% of them reported any taxable capital gains at all, most of them very small. And combined, they received just 15% of all capital gains and an even smaller share of the tax benefits. So capital gains are concentrated precariously among the highest income households, as are the favorable tax benefits offered by the current tax system. The vast majority of Canadians will not be affected directly by this change. Most do not receive capital gains at all, and most of those who do receive gains well under the threshold for the higher inclusion rate. But those Canadians will benefit from the new programs I mentioned that these revenues will help fund. Second, some argue that reducing capital gains exemptions will discourage business capital investment. But the economic evidence shows no connection between capital gains exemptions and rates of business investment in new capital or research or productivity. Canada's business investment, especially in machinery and equipment, has been declining since the 1990s. Business and capital taxes have been significantly reduced in that same time. In the 90s, when the capital gains inclusion rate was 75% and the federal corporate tax rate was 28%, Canadian business invested 5.6% of national GDP in new machinery and equipment. In the last 10 years, with the inclusion rate at 50% and a 15% corporate tax rate, investment averaged 3.5% of GDP, 2 full percentage points of GDP lower. Research and development spending also declined in the same period, as has productivity growth. Many complex factors determine business investment, and reversing this decline is an urgent economic priority. And I have published my own research on the causes and consequences of slow investment. But it is clear that tax factors are at most a second-order determinant of business investment, and it is not credible to blame taxes for the poor performance of Canadian business investment in recent years. Indeed, in some ways, excessively favorable capital gains taxation can undermine corporate investment spending by distorting the choice between different capital structures and encouraging cash flow stripping from corporations. In sum, this reform is important for improving the fairness of Canada's tax system, reducing distortions that encourage tax avoidance and underinvestment, and just as important, will help fund new programs from the federal government that will make a positive difference in the lives of millions of Canadians. I recommend passage of this legislation. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stanford. And now we'll hear from the Wheat Growers Association and Mr. Jokum, please.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I'm grateful for the opportunity to appear before this committee. My name is Günther Jokum. I farm about 20 minutes west of Winnipeg with my wife and daughter. I'm also president of the Wheat Growers Association. We are a volunteer-based farm advocacy organization dedicated to developing ag policy solutions that strengthen the profitability and sustainability of farming and the agricultural industry. The average age of Canadian producers is over 55 years old, and over 98% of those farms are owned and operated by Canadian farm families. We are very concerned about the changes to the capital gains inclusion rate announced through Budget 2024. While we acknowledge the proposed increase to the lifetime capital gains exemption to $1.25 million, which recognizes the accelerating appreciation of farmland values, we are concerned, however, that the introduction of a 2/3 inclusion rate on capital gains makes it more expensive for young farmers like my daughter Fiona to take over the family farm. As farmers retire over the next decade, many of these farms will be transferred to the next generation. While this will secure retirement for thousands of farmers, the transfer will also incur capital gains. Under the proposed changes, nearly every grain farm across Canada will be impacted by a 2/3 capital gains inclusion rate. This is because the $1.25 million lifetime capital gains exemption is too low to account for rapidly appreciating farm values, and many will have already expended their exemption by the time they sell their farm, meaning most farms will have gains subject to the 2/3 inclusion rate. Furthermore, most Canadian grain farms are structured as corporations and do not benefit from the 50% inclusion rate for the first $250,000 of capital gains. When I consulted my tax accountants, he estimated that I will pay 30% more taxes. These numbers are staggering. And if the capital gains inclusion rate is increased for family farms, it will impose a substantial tax burden on new farmers such as my daughter Fiona at the beginning of their careers. Budget 2024 emphasized fairness for every generation, and yet the proposed changes to capital gains exacerbate farm transfer challenges and make these transfers more expensive for the next generation of young farmers. Furthermore, Budget 2024 described that differences in taxation rates between income earned from wages, capital gains, and dividends currently favor the wealthiest among us. This policy inadvertently targets farmers who produce food to meet domestic and global demand, and as small businesses that are family run, they do not represent the wealthiest among us. General succession planning is a cornerstone in the agri-food sector, particularly farming. Currently, less than 1% of Canadians are involved in farming, a percentage that is likely to decrease over time. By making farming financially less attractive, the number of farms will continue to dwindle, leading to greater consolidation and fewer family-owned farms. Farmers are known for their ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit, and many have accumulated significant assets. However, farmers are often asset-rich and cash-poor, meaning they possess valuable assets such as farmland, quota, equipment, and livestock, but lack liquid cash. This becomes especially challenging with changes to the capital gains taxes. Often farmers sell a portion of their land or assets to facilitate intergenerational farm transfer, and they might realize a substantial capital gain, forcing them into difficult financial positions, requiring them to find ways to generate the necessary funds to meet fiscal obligations. Increased capital gains taxes could complicate estate planning and succession, as the tax burden on asset transfers may be higher, which could lead to more family farms being sold off or broken up to pay taxes. All this flies in the face of what Budget 2024 calls fairness for every generation. Thank you for your consideration.
Well, thank you, Mr. Yoakum. And now, members, witnesses, we're moving into members' questions time. And in the first round of questions, each party will have up to 6 minutes to ask you questions. We're starting with MP Morantz for the first 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to thank all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Stefanik, I particularly want to thank you for being here. It's always nice to have a fellow Winnipegger at committee. And I remember very well when you phoned me, you and I had never spoken before or even met. You phoned me, I think, just a couple days after the budget was tabled. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, and your concern was over the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate. And when you bought your business, you were basically, looking for a way to work hard and save for your retirement to make sure that you had a secure retirement and life for your family. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
And you don't have a public sector pension like members of parliament get or high-paid civil servants get. Is that right?
No.
Yeah, and your only source of retirement income is the money you've accumulated in your company. That's right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And the company owns a building, I think. Is that right as well?
Yeah, that was part of the purchase, yeah.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I think is inherently unfair, and I think we heard one of the other witnesses talk about this, it's ironic that the budget was called Fairness for Every Generation, but it's not so fair for your generation. You decided to incorporate when you bought your business, and the policy that the government's putting forward actually excludes corporations from the $250,000 exemption at 50%. Do you think that's fair?
Absolutely not. I mean, I should have stayed sole proprietor. The whole thing is your plan for the future based on what is current. I have a problem with people talking about this tax being something that the one lady about billionaires. I mean, I'm not a billionaire. Like, I am boots on the ground, hardworking Canadian. I feel that when politicians talk, they're talking about myself. But when someone's trying to use a narrative to state their case with regards to studies and surveys and reports, I can tell you, like, there's a lot of people in my situation that are your next door neighbor. And it's frustrating to all heck because it makes it, when you start talking surveys, reports, that tells me that you haven't lived my life. And I'm sitting here listening to it, and it's frustrating. It's very frustrating.
I hear you, and I'm hoping my colleagues on the Liberal side and NDP and Bloc side of this committee are hearing you as well. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that the finance minister said, well, they made it sound like it wasn't that big a deal. Only 0.13% of Canadians are going to be hurt by the increase in this inclusion rate for the capital gains. Do you consider yourself to be among the wealthiest 0.13% of Canadians?
No, definitely not.
No, and this is going to.
I'm sitting here working.
Yeah, yeah, and when it comes time for you to sell your business, your building, the investments that you saved up for your retirement, you'll wind up paying tax at the 2/3 inclusion rate. And your plan was based on the 50% inclusion rate. So do you kind of feel like the rug's been pulled out from under you?
Well, I feel like, everybody in my age category that did an alternate pathway, didn't work hard and buy a business and gainful employed people to get ahead, is going to retire before me, and I'm going to have to work longer. You talk about fairness. It's just not fair. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense. I think it's that people have lost touch there. I don't think they really understand how many people are in like me there.
And do you feel unfairly targeted by this change?
Well, I mean, targeted. I'm not sure I'm targeted. However, I do believe it's unfair. And I just think if they actually knew, if they wanted to call and talk to me about it, I can explain to them my thoughts and my journey.
Yeah. Well,
it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And you're doing a very good job of that right now, by the way, and it really matters. Now, just out of curiosity, one of the things about business people is that they're risk takers. And, you may want to grow your business or had plans to grow your business. Do you think that increasing the price you're going to have to pay on your gains to the federal government is going to make you more or less inclined to make further investments in your business?
No, it stifles. It doesn't make sense for me. Why should I put more effort in and take more risk only to pay more taxes? It makes no sense. Like, I don't have, like I say, I don't have an economic background. I don't read reports on a regular basis. I just understand, being the person here working hard. I started out right sweeping the floors and all the way up. And it just seems like now, what did I do that for? I have no words really. And thanks very much for listening, everybody. And I am open to talk to anybody offline if they want to, that is actually making this change, just to realize that the effect that you're having on people and families.
Thank you, Mr. Stefanik. Appreciate it, and I'm sure there'll be more questions. That's the time. MP Morantz and MP Sorbara, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here this morning on a very, very important discussion that we're having. I'd like to start off with Mr. Stanford and Jim. Welcome to you. In your comments, you use the words of both a fairer Canada and a healthier Canada. And from my understanding, a fairer Canada would mean a tax system that is more neutral and efficient. And a healthier Canada would mean that the choices that we've made as a government to invest in dental care, pharmacare, early learning and childhood, national program of $10 daycare, and the Canada Child Benefit and other programs. That to me means a healthier Canada. And I wanted you to comment with regards to those two themes that you brought up in your remarks.
Thank you, sir, for that question. Well, I'm glad that you picked up on those two words. I chose them carefully for that exact reason. We aren't just discussing a tax measure in isolation. The purpose of our tax system is to fund government's ability to sustainably support the programs that government delivers. And the additional revenues that will come from this reform and how we treat capital gains are clearly intended to support the additional program initiatives that were also announced in the budget. And I think several of those are very important, both for a stronger economy, but a healthier one, as you note. So school lunches, for example, is a program where Canada is one of the only industrial countries in the world that provides no assistance for school lunches, particularly for families from low incomes. That is clearly going to improve both physical and mental health. The dental care program, which is rolling out, obviously with the leadership of your NDP colleagues, is clearly going to improve health among the older Canadians and lower income Canadians. And the reports that we're receiving from millions of people signing up for that program indicate clearly that it's meeting an unmet need. We could say the same thing about the disability benefit, some of the affordable housing measures, et cetera. Those programs are associated with revenue flows, expenses that are, I think, modest in the grand scheme of the federal budget and the overall economy, but important. And in order to meet the government's fiscal targets at the same time, they have to be funded. So
Yes. No,
in that regard, the connection between the two is important.
Thank you, Jim. And look, I want to put on the record as an economist and someone who spent over 20 years of both in working on Wall Street and Bay Street, I look at the change in the capital gains inclusion rate as the right thing to do. And if you look at what the IMF has stated, and just to put this on the record, the inclusion rate change improves the tax system neutrality with respect to different forms of capital income and is likely to have no significant impact on investment or productivity growth. And following that, you can read the remarks from the University of Toronto's professor Michael Smart, professor of taxation and economics, University of Toronto. I've often argued we needed to change or go away with a thing called surplus stripping. It's basically a tax avoidance strategies where folks take advantage of the differential tax rates in our system. So a tax system needs to be neutral, efficient, fair, and progressive. This change in the capital gains inclusion rate, not the effective tax rate, but the inclusion rate, moves us in that step. And when you choose as a government and showing responsible leadership, this is actually the right thing to do from a tax system to make it more neutral, efficient, fair, and progressive, and to help middle-class Canadians and seniors. 2 million seniors have signed up and been approved for our dental care program. More than 200,000 have gone to see the dentist. Pharmacare, diabetes medication, contraceptives for women, childcare, the national food benefit, things that Canadians need and use every day. Now, I would like to go to Mr. Stefanovic, if I pronounce your name correctly. Thank you for opening your business. Thank you for being in the trades. My understanding you're in the plumbing business. With regards to, in Canada, we have a small business taxation, a very favorable rate of 9% that small businesses enjoy. And that is something we reduced from 11 to 9% in the early part of our mandate. In addition, you are aware, sir, with regards to a corporation, you'll have different forms of income in your corporation. You'll have interest if you invest in that way, dividends. But you'll also have the opportunity to use the registered retirement savings plans and TSFAs for your retirement. I just wanted to confirm with you that you have used like an RRSP program or TSFA program to also fund your retirement. Is that correct, sir?
As a small business owner, We basically look how things work out at the end of the year, and if there is some money left over, then it's usually reinvested. However, a small portion would be towards retirement. On the personal side, because I'm an employee, because it's a corporation, I'm an employee of my business. So I happen to, just like everybody else, pay my tax under my bracket, and basically I'm able to use that for RSPs, is provided that my family's taken care of and all the bills are paid. So it's no different than probably yourself or what have you. The only thing is I'm not a public servant of any sort. It's all private. That's all. Does that answer your question? Sorry if I...
No. You've done a great job answering the question. I wish to thank you for being here. Your testimony, I appreciated it. But we really need to understand, small business corporations in Canada have a tax rate of 9%. You do, when you running a corporation, when you do pull money out of the corporation, and you decide what amount you wish to pull out at the end of the year, then you make your decisions, investing in your RSP, your TSFA, reinvesting in your business and growing it, of course. And I love to hear that as well. And I think, and then turning over to this. Oh, are we done?
Yeah, we're reached the time. Yeah, so that's
Thank you.
that's it. So we're going to go now to MP Sainte-Marie for questions, and MP Sainte-Marie.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Salutations.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to all the witnesses. This is an issue that we want to look at very closely. And unfortunately, the measure is coming into effect next week, but the bill itself won't be studied until next fall, and that is a great misfortune. I don't know if Professor Godbout has noted that is the case. The Conservatives increased the rate of inclusions to 60%. The Liberals dropped it to 50%, and so you can see that the roles seem to be reversed this time. My question is for Mr. Godbout. Thank you for being with us. First of all, very often they say for capital gains, there's an inclusion rate that is under 100% to be fairer, because the capital gains have to be weighed against combating inflation. What do you think of this type of argument, and what would be a fair rate if that were the case? Well, you can hear it said that there is a preferential rate in terms of capital gains, taking into account the price of the sale and inflation. It is true if you sell after a year. It's true it's less true if you sell after, say, 12 years. But on the other hand, the advantage is not just the disposal of the capital gains. An employee pays every 2 weeks on their check. They're taxed, and you can put that off in terms of years. So in terms of inflation, that has to be taken into consideration. Now, if we could have integrated it better. If the sale were to be within 12 months, it could have been exempted, and the rate of inclusion could be whole over the 12 months. I don't want to add to the general confusion, but that does exist in other jurisdictions. Thank you. Other questions were asked around the table here a few minutes ago. The government wants to target 0.13% of the richest people, who represent 40,000 people in actual fact. These 40,000 people every year, if you look at it in terms of the average family, they would be included in the richest for 1 year. but not the following year. I'm wondering if you have done any longitudinal studies on this matter. Do you know what percentage of people who would be targeted by this for other income years if they, say, don't fall into the category now of the 0.13%? Well, I don't have statistics in front of me, but I can speak generally to this over a long period. If you look at it over that long period, they are taxed one time. So there is, Mr. Stanford talked about it strongly concentrate on the rich, but they're going to become richer slowly in terms of statistics. If you, there has to be some nuance brought to the issue. There are a certain number of people who say only fall into that category once and once only. But I can tell you with respect to the stats on the rich, it's usually at the time of the year of death. It is a way of redistributing wealth at that time in terms of future generations, because even if the people who are deceased are no longer taxpayers, they are actually contributing over a given year's time to the future. This is the calculation that we have made. Yes, thank you. I think that will help us better study the issue. Now, for small and medium-sized businesses now, exemptions that are in place. Let's turn to that. The first $1.25 million excluded from capital gains is indexed. Now, if I've understood correctly, an extra $2 million would have an inclusion rate of 33%, and that would be an incentive for entrepreneurs. In terms of the Ways and Means motion, we don't have it. We just have a draft of it, hopefully by the end of June. I think that would be just for the founding shareholder, the person who actually founded the business. That supplementary amount would not necessarily pass on to the other proprietors if the business were sold. So I want to hear your comments on this. This $1.25 million. I think that would be advantageous for those who get a capital gains exemption of about $25 million. I don't know if you've done this type of computation. Well, thank you for your question. Mr. Stefanik, it could apply to him. Say he has a $1,250,000 that is free of tax at the time. But if he adds the spouse, that increases. Therefore, you can multiply the amounts to $1.25 million. Now, with the change in capital gains, it was supposed to be $1 million this year in 2024, and the day after, June 25th, it would be the $25 million, as you've pointed out. As a Canadian incentive, it could be more restrictive because it is limited to the founding shareholder, the person who founded the business. The others would not be entitled. And I don't know how the bill will read finally, but you can't multiply it in terms of people who buy into the business. So it's limiting. So they're going to offer a rate which is half the rate of inclusion. If it's 67, we will go to 35%. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, MP Samari. And now to MP Davies, please.
Thank you, Ms. Brusk, and maybe to Mr. Cochrane and Senator the Economist as well for the CLC. You touched on this, Ms. Brusk, but in April 2024, Mr. Cochrane, you co-authored a report titled Canada's Shift to a More Regressive Tax System, 2004 to 2022. which found that in 2022, the total tax rate for the lowest household income decile, it's the bottom 10%, was 35%, whereas the total tax rate for the top 1% was 24%. Moreover, the report found that the top 5% of Canadians paid a lower rate in 2022 than the bottom 95% of Canadians, with the top 1% paying an even lower rate. Can you explain why Canada's tax system imposes a higher total tax rate on the bottom 95% of households versus the top 5%?
Can I explain the why?
Yeah.
No, because there's no justification. There is zero justification for that. It's completely contrary to how our tax system is supposed to work. So the why, no, I can't answer
How would
that.
you characterize that situation?
Incredibly unfair and frankly deleterious to every aspect of our society.
Thank you. Mr. Jokum, thank you for farming. My grandfather farmed from 1926 to 1960, was a grain farmer on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Thank you for growing our country's food. I want to talk to you a little bit about family farms. Now, my understanding is that in this budget, it would increase the lifetime capital gains exemption on the sale of family farms from $1 million to $1.25 million. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
And I understand that also when you sell a farm, you also can benefit from the principal residence deduction, meaning that you can eliminate entirely from capital gains your home and 1.24 acres in addition, so that's completely tax-free. Are you aware of that, sir?
Yes, I am. However, it doesn't always work that way in family farm transfer. And that's what I'm really concerned about. Our daughter came back from working in the ag industry, and we're in the process of family farm transfer. And this new tax will add a lot of tax
that's what I'm trying to explore.
implications.
Now, I know that when we put assets in joint ownership, then that property passes, it simply would avoid tax and disposition at all. Could you add your daughter's name as a joint owner to the farm and avoid that disposition entirely?
That I'm not sure of. I would have to check that out with my accountant.
Okay.
And we're working on that. I am a farmer, not a tax lawyer.
Of course, no, I appreciate that.
I did call him before this meeting here today, and he said, absolutely, it will increase my tax burden going forward.
So just two other quick questions. I understand, and we'll get into this with another witness on stacking. If you were passing your farm to 3 children, each of those children could add cumulatively their capital gains exemptions. Were you aware of that, sir? You maybe only have the one daughter, is that right?
No, we have 4 daughters, but
so if you were
it's only the one daughter that's interested in farming.
Right. But if you were to transfer your farm to 4 of your children, are you aware that those 4 people can cumulatively stack their capital gains exemptions? So in this case, it would be a total of $5 million of lifetime exemption.
Right. So I was not aware of that. However, spreading it out to non-farming family members, like the other kids, is a pretty surefire way of destroying the family farm.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not suggesting your personal situation. I'm talking about just the structure of it. Finally, I don't know if you're aware, but when capital gains were imposed in this country or brought in this country in 1972, the rate was 50%. In 1988, the Mulroney Conservative government raised it to 66.6%. And in 1990, they raised it again to 75%. Today, this proposal would actually bring it back to the 50% rate that still was in place in 1972, but raise to 66.6% only on that amount over $250,000. Are you suggesting, sir, that we should go back to the 1972 rates in this country?
I'm suggesting that this budget is not fair to generational to multi-generational farms. And my farm is my retirement. Just like Mrs. Stefanik said, I don't have fancy RSP because I invested everything into my farm. And now I get penalized for doing that versus you yourself or some of my other kids who have very good jobs, pay into an RSP, their employer pays into an RSP, and yet they do not face this tax increase.
Well, sir, you will be left with 33% of your capital gain is still tax-free. So you'll still retain that benefit. Mr. Stanford, can you please explain the stacking, the way that stacking might work under this new provision? I'll give you an example. Many people are concerned how this might affect a second property, rental property, a second home. In the case of couples where secondary residence is 50% owned by each spouse, each of them is entitled to $250,000 exemption, making a $500,000 exemption. Same thing with the farm. Can you explain that to us?
Well, since the capital gains on the individual personal tax return is defined according to each individual, not according to a family or a household, that's how our tax system works, then each individual claiming a capital gains will be able to access all of those exemptions and thresholds. So that includes the 1.25 million lifetime exemption for farms and small business, could go to each member of a family. And then the annual $250,000 threshold before you move into the 66% inclusion rate could also be claimed by each member of family. So a good example would be a cottage. We hear a lot about cottage owners and a cottage that's in the family. Well, if it is in the family and owned jointly, then that $250,000 threshold could apply each year for each individual in the family. On top of that, we of course have a bit of an income averaging system in our capital gains system, the capital gains reserve, which generally will allow you to average out one-time capital gains over 5 years, or in the case of passing property to your children, even longer. So the stackability across members of a family and the potential for averaging over multiple years means that most people with a second home are going to be able, I think, to avoid the 66% inclusion rate entirely and continue to pay capital gains at the existing 50% rate.
Thank you, MP Davies. That's the time. Members, we're moving into our second round of questions. Times are a little bit different in this round, and we're starting with MP Lawrence for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I'll just start by just correcting a little bit of incorrect tax advice that Mr. Davies offered from the floor here. Number one, simply by putting in a property...
Point of order, I wasn't giving tax advice, just to be clear.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Davies. Simply by putting something in joint tenancy does not avoid, or putting someone in joint name, it actually triggers the tax at that point. And in fact, stacking would work for the next generation, which means his kids could multiply the capital gains exemption, but he cannot unless his wife also owns the corporation. So just I would strongly advise that Mr. Davies maybe perhaps review the tax law before he starts making commentary. Now, I'm also struck by the fact that we have a series of individuals who get their money either from government or are tenured or otherwise, who are making pronouncements about the lives of business owners. And we actually have business owners here who directly contradict what they've said. And I think anyone at home would be well aware of the facts here. We've heard from a tenured professor that, no, this won't discourage business investment. We've heard from business owners that, in fact, it will reduce tenure, or that it will reduce their investment in businesses. This is costing people jobs. This is costing people real lives. This is hurting people financially. Mr. Joachim, my first questions will be for you, sir. You talked a little bit about the effect of the tax changes. I want to go back a little bit. And first of all, if you don't mind sharing me, does your family farm pay carbon tax?
Yes, we do. We pay, there are certain segments that are exempt, but there's a lot of hidden carbon tax that's paid. About 75 to 85% of what I produce is exported, and it is transported on the Canadian rail system, either CP or CN, and they pay carbon tax on the fuel that they use, and they do pass it on to the farmer. The same with the grain elevators that receive our grain, and anything they use within their system and adds cost, that would be the carbon tax, is again passed on to the farmer. So there's lots of hidden carbon tax that we pay that is not a line item within our bookkeeping, but it is there.
So
and APAS did a great study out of Saskatchewan as far as how much carbon tax we pay, and it's staggering.
Thank you very much. And so now this Liberal government is adding insult to injury to farmers. So in addition to the thousands of dollars, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars of carbon tax, they're now increasing the capital gains inclusion. And the capital gains inclusion from the advice that you've received from your tax professionals is that it will increase your tax burden and make it more difficult to pass a family farm onto your daughter. Is that your understanding?
That is correct. My farm is my retirement, and a family transfer, farm transfer, is a very difficult job to do to satisfy everyone's need within the family. My parents moved from Germany to Canada in 1980. We had a very small farm in Germany. We bought a smaller than average size farm here in Manitoba back in 1980. And I came back from university to the farm in 1984. And on the advice of my accountant, I did pay a little bit into RSPs, but he said, you're better off investing in your farm because you want to grow it where the farm is financially viable to support your family. And so we have grown it over the last 44 years into a larger than average size farm, which supports 3 households at the moment. We have done that when I was married. We lived for 12 years in a house, had very little furniture, made lots of sacrifices to grow the farm. And we grew the farm not in order to sell it at the end of my farming career and live in luxury with the millions. No, we grew
Thank
the
you,
farm.
sir. Thank you. I'm just running out of time. I'm running out of time. And I would like to just seek unanimous consent for this committee to agree that farmers and plumbers should be exempted from the capital gains legislation.
Sure. I'm not saying unanimous consent.
No one said no.
No one said no.
Who said no? Who said no?
Unanimous consent that farmers, union members, and plumbers be exempt from the capital gains inclusion increase. That this commitment makes such a commitment.
Yeah, it's a motion.
Do you see?
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair. Is that a motion that we would need notice for?
I'm asking for unanimous consent.
I'll just suspend for a second. So, yes, you can ask for unanimous consent. No. Oh, okay. We'll continue. And we are off to MP Thompson, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Stanford, are there any inaccuracies that you've heard in the previous couple of rounds that you'd like to speak to or correct?
I guess one thing I might try to elaborate a little bit is the question of the impact of capital gains inclusion on capital investment by businesses. Machinery and investment decisions, machinery and equipment decisions by companies are based on their judgment that the business will be profitable going forward, and the capital gains, the relevance of the capital gains inclusion rate to that decision is not at all clear. The capital gains will result at the end from perhaps selling the business or selling shares in the business, but growing a profitable business that you think can meet a need and generate a return on investment itself isn't subject to capital gains. So when you buy a new piece of machinery, you're adding to the asset value of the company. You're hopefully generating new revenue and profit from that. And as long as that company continues, then this change will have no impact on you. So in that regard, capital gains is not an incentive for starting and running a business. It's an issue related to selling the business.
Thank you, and I appreciate the clarification. I'm just going to switch to the Canadian Labour Congress and Ms. Broskin. And before I ask the question, I do want to note that in my riding of St. John's East, the average salary is $50,000, and in Carleton, in Ontario, it's $58,000. Calgary, Forest Lawn, $32,000. Northumberland, Peterborough, $41,000, and Simcoe North, $38,000. How many of your workers see capital gains increases of $250,000?
Virtually none of those workers would be impacted by this, that we can tell. We know that at least a quarter, almost a third of Canadian workers do not have a private or a public pension other than their CPP that they might be eligible for. So I understand and I empathize with those individuals who have built a business, who are using this as a retirement vehicle, and there are ways to navigate that through the lifetime exemption that's going to be indexed and all those kinds of things. But what I'm thinking about is the worker working in a service sector industry for 65 years, can't afford to retire, who has not had the opportunity to put any money aside whatsoever at all. We need a fair taxation system so that we can fund the very programs that workers are going to be relying on: the school nutrition program, dental care, pharmacare, health, workplace safety and health issues, things like making sure our healthcare system works so that those workers actually have the ability to put some additional money in their pockets to maybe put towards an RSP.
Thank you. And very quickly, how many of your unionized workers would have a secondary residence growing in value of about $250,000?
Unless they've inherited some wealth, I don't see any of them falling into that category.
Do you believe that both the employers and the C-suite executives hold a larger part of the capital gains? Do you believe that this will trickle down to your unionized members across the country? In other words, that a top-down approach. So if we make changes and alter what I believe is a fair program in terms of the capital gains, the changes that exist, does that trickle down to workers?
As we heard from some of the other witnesses, we don't anticipate seeing any change in the terms of investments or productivity based on a change to the capital gains exclusions. And so I don't see any of this trickling down to the average worker going to work every single day of their life.
Quickly, Mr. Stanford, back to you. And apart from what I think the very positive changes for Canadians in Budget 2024, back to capital gains, what group do you feel will be disproportionately impacted by these changes, or what income group?
Well, the evidence is clear, both from a snapshot in time of who pays taxes on capital gains in any given year, and then the limited longitudinal data which has been compiled, that the main impact of this change will be on the highest 1 to 2% of Canadian taxpayers. In any given year, only 0.13% of them individually will claim capital gains over $250,000 and therefore have any capital gains at all, subject to the higher inclusion rate. But even over time, given that there are irregularities in how capital gains are staged in someone's life, even over time, the vast majority of those gains are concentrated at the top. In fact, over time, they're more concentrated at the top than in a given year, for the fact that it's very well-off people who tend to claim capital gains year after year rather than a one-time event. So it's not only those people. There are obviously circumstances where an individual of generally modest means will face some additional taxation because of this, but the vast majority of the impact will be felt by the highest income Canadians only.
And thank you, MP Thompson. Now to MP Samari, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'm going to bring up a point of order. I would remind the colleagues that when you bring forward a motion, it has to be in writing, and the official translation has to accompany it. the interpreters must not be called upon to interpret the motion. We have to have the translation that accompanies the original, and that would be very much appreciated. I bring this up to my colleagues in the committee. Let me turn to Mr. Godbout for a question. We are receiving in our writings letters from professionals, many of them, many letters that are single ownership, sole proprietors, and that are corporations, and they don't have the generated income that would put them in the highest level, but they do not seem to be excluded nonetheless from the 1.25 figure. Am I wrong in my thinking? Would there be any type of justified deferral treatment for this particular category of people? Are you talking about people that are not incorporated? It would seem yes. In that case, well, for the 250,000, they should be entitled to it if they make a gain, a capital gains. But with respect to the exemption of $250,000, this is offered on the basis of shares for small businesses. If they don't generate that, they will not have the exemption for small business shares. But this is not a phenomenon that is new, that arises from this legislation. That goes back to the initial type of legislation that was in place. For farmers, it could be agricultural goods or otherwise, but or for non-agricultural activities, though, it would be different, and businesses would be limited to 1.25. Well, thank you very much. I'm not a businessman. I have more knowledge about unions. So for people who wouldn't be incorporated, they would have access to the 250,000. So it's clear. Thank you.
MP Samari, and now to MP Davies, please.
Thank you. Dr. Stanford, in an article recently, you wrote, most academic economists support a higher inclusion rate, partly because it levels the playing field between different types of capital income. Why do most academic economists support a higher inclusion rate?
Yeah, that's on the basis of, for example, surveys of articles published by the Canadian Tax Foundation and commentary from several academic economists. Mr. Smart's work was already referenced earlier today, but many others. There's a longstanding concern about the level playing field between different forms of capital income. And of course, you know, there's a long discussion about making sure that capital income isn't taxed twice, once at the corporate level and then again at the individual level. That is the theoretical justification for the favorable treatment of all forms of capital income. But across the different types of capital income, there's been an emerging and growing inequality in how dividend income is treated versus capital gains income. And because of two things. Number one, an inclusion rate that is too low in order to reach that equality with dividends. And secondly, the decline in the corporate tax rate in Canada over the last couple of decades. It's clear that the treatment of capital gains is now much favorable than the treatment of dividends. And that creates an enormous incentive for companies and tax planners to try and transform any type of income into capital gains rather than interest or other forms of dividend income. And there can be significant efficiency losses from that unequal level playing field. So I think that's the main reason that this idea of increasing the inclusion rate to 2/3 or even 75%, maybe many academic economists have suggested 75% makes sense.
Thank you. And maybe to you and to Ms. Bruska together to comment on, we have heard some professionals, including doctors, claim that they will be hurt by this measure. Dr. Stanford, you wrote, most professionals incorporate to obtain generous tax and liability benefits. capital gains exemptions are just the icing on that very sweet cake, and most of that icing is still there. Doctors and other professionals can fund retirement like the rest of us via CPP, RSPs, TFSAs, and savings, despite a smaller capital gains loophole. Do doctors and other professionals who choose to incorporate face any unique challenges or barriers to accessing retirement savings than other Canadians? And I would just note that Stats Canada says that today approximately 2/3 of Canadians have no form of workplace pension coverage. I think Ms. Brusk, you commented on that. So I don't know if doctors are facing any particular challenge that most workers are in that regard. Your comments?
I don't think that doctors are facing any particular challenges. They have the opportunity to avail themselves of RSPs, TSFAs, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm more concerned about is the average orderly working in a hospital being taxed on 100% of his or her salary while a doctor is not.
Davies, and now we'll go to MP Chambers for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Dr. Stanford, thanks for appearing back at committee. I know you're no stranger here, so welcome back. You cited a number of statistics, and frankly, I don't dispute any of them because I think we're looking at the same data. In particular, I think there are obviously very wealthy people who have a significant number of capital gains per year. But the same data, the LAD data bank also shows that capital gains are very, very rare in a person's lifetime. And frankly, if there is a capital gain over $250,000, that it is a once or twice in a lifetime event for a large number of tax filers. In fact, those who have over $250,000 in capital gains on a perennial basis, i.e., say 10 out of 10 years, is only about 160 tax filers out of the sample that they showed. So it is, in fact, a small number of taxpayers which may get a large break. But would you agree that there are some individuals who once or twice in a lifetime will get caught up in this capital gains hike?
Certainly that's true, and I think I said that in my previous intervention. A few things to keep in mind there. Number one, there are important opportunities for individuals who have a rare capital gains event to try and reduce and average out their exposure, and that includes the $250,000 exemption, obviously, from the higher rate, which is stackable across a joint ownership situation. And it also includes the capital gains reserve system, which allows people with an occasional capital gains to average that out over several years. And I'll also point out that this same argument could be applied to other features of our tax system. We have a marginal system of increasing marginal tax rates on personal income, and there are people who end up in the top rate just once or twice in their lifetime, but they still earn that income in that particular year. We do not have a generalized income averaging system in our tax system. And so on some level, if you've made that much money in a year, you should indeed pay taxes on it.
Indeed. That's the way the progressive tax system works. There was also a statistic that suggested, using the same database, that 50% of those who have gains over $250,000 otherwise have other taxable income of less than $120,000. And some individuals, 10% of these in this category, have incomes of less than $20,000. Would you support, or do you think it would be wise to try to narrow the impact of the capital gains measure on just those individuals who are truly in that top 1% to 2% of income earners and not apply to 100% of the general public?
Well, again, the number of individuals who claim who receive large capital gains year after year is small, but they account for an overwhelming share of the total capital gains that are claimed, and an overwhelming and even larger share of the tax benefits associated with that. Now, clearly, the government was attempting to narrow the impact of this measure with the $250,000 threshold, and again, they were following advice from academic economists who've been publishing on this for years. So at some
Mr.
point,
Stanford, I'm going to run out of time. Mr. Stanford, I'm going to run out of time. So I just quickly, would you be in favor of narrowing the application so it's just for those who have high perennial either capital gains incomes or total incomes?
I think there's provisions in the existing legislation that do that, the $250,000 threshold,
So-
and other provisions in our tax system,
Understood.
including the capital
I'll take that
gains
as a
reserve.
yes. Understood. Ms. Brusk, you suggested that many of your members wouldn't be impacted by this, but you have about 3 million members, right? I know of a number of your members who own rental properties that hold them, and not a number of rental properties, but even just one or two that actually hold them in a corporation. They will be taxed. Like, this will impact them immediately. Should we exclude them from this legislation?
The number of members that are in that profitable position are minimal at best, I would argue. The members that I hear from, the workers that I hear from, are certainly not in that kind of a wealthy situation where they have to worry about these situations in terms of the capital gains being increased on their profits.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MP Chambers. Now to PS Turnbull, please, for 5 minutes.
Well, great conversation. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Stanford, I'll start with you. Welcome back. You mentioned in your opening remarks about sort of double barrel fairness, and I thought that was an interesting way to put the fact that this new tax measure is increasing tax fairness while also increasing fairness in terms of the investments that are being made. I wanted to ask you, though, about Kevin Milligan's comments on this. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I found both your article that was recently published, but also his remarks that were published online really interesting. He said that a lot of the people that criticize these new tax fairness measures are not offering any alternatives to push back on inequality. And I found that really interesting because he said, well, basically you can infer from this, they don't really care about inequality often in our society. And when Kevin Milligan put the question to himself online, is this new inclusion rate change really effective and efficient? Is it an effective and efficient measure among the others that can be considered? He said yes. Would you agree with that, Mr. Stanford, that this new capital gains change is really effective and efficient as a tax measure for addressing inequality?
Yes, I would, for the reason that capital gains income has become so unduly concentrated among the highest income categories of society, more so than other types of income. And this actually reflects the proactive use of these loopholes by clever tax planners to arrange income so that it comes through a capital gains channel rather than through other channels. And so this is where Mr. Milligan and Professor Milligan and other academic economists want to see a more equal treatment between capital gains and dividends income. So because capital gains are so concentrated at the top end, anything that reduces incrementally the tax advantages of capital gains treatment will have a very powerful impact in reducing inequality through the tax system.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Zurub, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, Canadians for Tax Fairness. I was interested in your report that I found on your website about productivity and capital gains inclusion rates, which I read with great interest. And I note that you had said in your opening remarks that there's no correlation between capital gains rates or even by the look of it, tax rates and productivity. As has been claimed numerous times, mostly by conservatives, I think, that are trying to push back against this. What I noticed in the report, though, was that, in fact, what I am inferring from this, and I think it's explicit, that on page 5, it says that there's researchers have begun to establish a causal relationship between inequality and productivity. So it's as if the opposite is the truth, which is that the more inequality we have in our society, the less productive we are. And isn't that kind of the heart of the issue? I think Conservatives are trying to say, well, we don't want to address inequality because it will hurt investment and productivity. But I'm actually inferring from this report and the data that you've published here as inferring the exact opposite is the truth, is that if we don't increase tax fairness, if we don't address inequality, then we will continue to struggle with productivity and investment. Is that true from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that's generally right. I wouldn't want to go too far to say that inequality is the single biggest driver of productivity, of falling productivity growth or something like that. But I certainly think that, yeah, if workers are being paid very little, they have less incentive to work harder. And, we've seen after decades of trickle-down economics at this point that it has not increased productivity greatly. So I do think that we should make inequality a more explicit goal of our policies.
Okay, thank you for that. How much time do I have left, Chair?
You have 35 seconds.
Okay, so maybe just a quick question. I owned a corporation for 13 years that I ran, and I know that there's significant tax benefits to incorporating, and that's why most sole proprietors, when they get to a certain point of generating enough income, they incorporate because you actually get some tax benefits to that. I don't know who to direct this to, but Mr. Cochrane, I know you're an economist. Do you know of the tax benefits from incorporating? I'm specifically sort of interested in farms and other businesses, plumbers, etc., that own their own business and are incorporated. I think they pay significantly less income tax than other members of our society. Is that not true?
And Mr. Cochrane, I'll need a very short answer, like 15 seconds.
Yeah, I'm not a tax lawyer. I'm not a tax accountant, and we already saw that you get called out if you try to give tax advice. But Dr. Stanford has already mentioned that there are many ways that incorporating delivers certain tax benefits, and as it was said, the capital gains exclusion is just the icing on the cake. So those benefits all still exist.
And members saying that we rarely have this, but we have enough time for a full third round. And so we're starting with MP Helen for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to make this quick, and I'm hoping we can get to a vote quickly. I hope you'll pause my time because I wanted to move a motion that we have tabled, and I believe it's been distributed to everyone. That given the large workload the committee has on the docket, the committee instructs the chair to book 5 meetings between July 8th and September 13th while the House is adjourned to deal with unfinished business and pressing matters facing Canadians, including the cost of living crisis, housing crisis, and the impact capital gains tax changes will have on Canadian small businesses. Common sense Conservatives are moving this motion because after 9 years of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal NDP government, they've created a cost of living crisis. Mortgages and rents have doubled. Housing costs are out of control, all while there is a housing crisis that this government caused. Carbon tax 1 and 2 has made gas, groceries, and home heating more expensive. 1 in 4 Canadians that we found out today are not just food insecure, but living in poverty, and there's a record food bank usage across the country. OSFI is warning of a price shock for mortgage holders. Loan loss provisions at Canada's banks are at all-time highs. Organized crime and foreign actors are involved in money laundering in Canada. TD Bank is accused of money laundering the proceeds of fentanyl sales by Chinese drug lords. The job-killing capital gains tax hike punishes workers, small business owners, farmers, fishers, tradespeople, and the family members who inherit property from loved ones. Justin Trudeau has doubled the national debt, and now Canada spends more on servicing the debt than it does on healthcare transfers to the provinces. There are significant issues plaguing this country, yet the Liberal NDP government is more focused on ramming half-baked omnibus bills and tax hikes than listening to real Canadians who are suffering from Justin Trudeau's policies and Chrystia Freeland's spending, all being propped up by the NDP to protect Jagmeet Singh's pension. So common sense Conservatives are ready to work for Canadians over the summer. I hope that my other colleagues around the table are too. Thank you.
You see MP Davies' hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it's funny if there was a definition of hypocrisy in the dictionary, it would probably include this motion. I sat here in this meeting while the Conservatives wasted hour after hour after hour after hour. They read from a podcast in order to delay the work of this committee, as this committee, the Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois, tried to get at the very issues that Mr. Hallen just talked about. And the Conservatives wasted meeting after meeting after meeting in a flight of fancy to do things like calling Mark Carney because they think he's going to be the next Liberal leader, instead of focusing on the cost of living increase, hunger in communities in this country, passing a budget, bringing in tax credits for businesses across this country. The Conservatives delayed every one of those in order for their own partisan flights of fancy, instead of getting at those real issues. And here they are now on one of the last meetings of the year. By the way, at a meeting that they insisted on to study the capital gains inclusion rate, which, by the way, all parties supported because we do want to hear from witnesses. And they were wasting time in the last hour when we have witnesses here to give evidence. You know, this is classic. Common sense, common sense isn't coming to conclusions without data or science. That's the opposite of common sense. That's ridiculousness. I mean, to hear Mr. Hallen talk about the job-killing capital gains measure, we just started the study. We're into it an hour and a half. And by the way, the evidence I'm hearing is frankly to the contrary of that. We haven't heard any real evidence of any impact whatsoever. In fact, we have economists here telling us there will be zero impact on job creation in this country on this capital gains measure. But of course, the Conservatives don't let facts get in the way of conclusions. I mean, they've already made up their mind on this. So, absolutely. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm hearing cat calling from the side while I have the mic, and it's difficult. I didn't yell and
MPs,
talk
members, please
talking.
allow, the member has the floor. MP Davies, the floor is yours. And members, if you could keep the chatter down, please.
Thank you. Instead of common sense, I'd like some common courtesy. Perhaps would be a rare thing to expect from my Conservative colleagues. So it's absolutely absurd. I mean, this is a stunt to call a committee in the summer. We can call a Section 106 meeting anytime this summer if an emergency comes up. And by the way, the other thing is that I don't know about the Conservatives, but spending time in our communities with our constituents to ask them what their needs are and to find out what's happening in their lives, I think is every bit, in fact, I would say more important than the Conservatives' partisan games to try to look like they're working hard in the summer because they wasted days and days of meetings here, which is what they did do. And that's not a matter of opinion. Go back and look at the record of meetings. It's a mathematical fact. So to hear Mr. Hallen talk about this as a common sense, this isn't common sense move. This is this is not common sense at all. And what I'd like to do is dispense with this motion right away so that I can go back and hearing from every one of these witnesses who has something important to say. They all have different perspectives, and I respect that. But I'm here to hear from them. And the Conservatives continue to do this. They move a motion in the middle of a meeting. They called this meeting and wanted witnesses to come and hear from them and then interrupt the witnesses that we all have called here to get the feedback that we need from them on an important public policy matter. And then they interrupt that and waste the last part of the meeting while we debate some motion that they have for partisan purposes. I'm trying to search for a phrase that describes that, but I'll tell you what, common sense is not one of them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to vote against this, and I think that we should have a quick vote on this. We can get back to hearing from the witnesses whose testimony I'm interested in hearing.
Okay, well, thank you, MP Davies. I see no other speakers. Clerk?
Dr. Fry? Dr. Fry votes against. Ms. Zarowitz?
I vote against.
Mr. Sorbara?
Contre.
Ms. Thompson.
Against.
Mr. Turnbull.
Against.
Mr. Chambers.
Yes.
Mr. Hallan.
In favor.
Mr. Fast.
En faveur.
Mr. Morantz.
In favor.
Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Contre.
Mr. Davies.
Contre.
Yeas pour 4, 4, nays contre 7, 7.
Okay, it's defeated. MP Helen?
I'll turn my time over to Mr. Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, just as a point of clarification, I'm not sure what this committee's practice is, but when a member has their time and they use it to move another motion, they don't lose their time? No? I've been on committees where they do.
So time is suspended at that time because it's committee
Thank you.
business. Yes. Okay.
Thanks for
MP Chambers.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. We'll go back to you, Ms. Brusk, about some of your members. Would you support narrowing the application of this such that we're not going to catch up people who otherwise have very modest incomes but that have a one-time capital gain event in their life from its application?
I don't support changes to a bill that has yet to be really fully delivered in that way. I think that a one-time event, there are ways to navigate those. We heard about the exemptions. We heard about various different opportunities to lessen the burden, so to speak. And so a one-time event is going to impact very few average workers across this country. The benefit of gaining additional tax revenue far outweighs that one-time event an average worker may have to increase that tax burden by, 13% more of their income being taxed.
Okay, so you're okay with the proposal, the Ways and Means motion, if that becomes the final bill, is that you're okay with that?
I am.
Okay. Mr. Stanford, or Dr. Stanford, I should say, you mentioned that the revenues from this tax were paying for some laudable public policy objectives. But when I look back at the projections from the Finance Department, just a year ago, the debt service costs versus today have gone up by $8 billion just in this current fiscal year, and about $10 billion per year for every year by the time we get to 5 years out. It seems to me that a large share of the revenue from this capital gains tax is actually just paying debt service costs.
If you look at the forecast, the budget forecasts, for some time they've been projecting an increase in debt service charges, both because of the increase in the overall number of size of the debt, but more importantly, the higher interest rates that we're currently grappling with. I think that there's a reasonable logic to linking the incremental spending that was announced in this budget with the incremental revenue measures that were also announced in this budget. Now, of course, money is fungible, so it all goes into the same pot.
I'll just cut in there. I'm linking it to the incremental increase in the debt service costs over and above what was projected a year ago. So, I mean, it's the exact same comparison you're making. You're saying that this money is going towards incremental savings, spending objectives for dental care, et cetera, but there's also incremental expenses that were not projected a year ago.
And the incremental expenses could have been covered from the other changes in revenue forecasts that were also part of this budget. So, I think you're right, sir, that because of the fungibility of money, you can't link $1 on the revenue side to a precise dollar on the expense side. But I think the fact that both of these were incremental policy announcements contained in the same budget, I think makes for a fair connection between the two.
Thank you. I'd be really appreciative of those on the call who have access to some of the data. If they would like to show the perennial capital gains earners, we could narrow this application to those who abuse the tax system and who transfer or try to claim more capital gains taxes than income tax. But I do think, as we've heard today, testimony from people who are living it that are suggesting that this tax isn't just going to be on the 0.13% top income earners. It's actually going to be on a much broader group of individuals. And with no disrespect to those who are educated, I'm reminded of William Buckley, who said he would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the phone book than the entire faculty of Harvard. And I would paraphrase it, suggest I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people of Ms. Bruss's members than some individuals who have not spent the time working in the trenches or building a business and who say in theory there are these rich people who abuse the system without actually listening to those who are living in the system saying, well, actually, I'm one of the people affected. I'm not that person you're speaking about. So appreciate the time today, and I'll yield the last and remaining seconds to the floor, Mr.
MP
Chair.
Chambers, and now we're going to go to MP Sorbara.
Thank you, Chair. There is one important element in this discussion that we haven't touched upon today, is with the capital gains inclusion rate change, there'll obviously be revenues being directed to the provinces and territories in a significant amount. And one of the comments that I've heard is this would impact doctors and so forth. And we have seen, for example, the province of British Columbia increase the pay of doctors considerably to deal with such issues. And the provinces, and including the province of Ontario, where I'm an MP from, will have the opportunity to use the funds that they'll receive from the inclusion rate change to increase the pay of doctors. I personally fundamentally feel that doctors, specialists, any folks in those occupations who have gone to school, invested in their human capital for many, many years, deserve to be rewarded for that. And they have a special skill in our society, and we need them. But they shouldn't have to depend on strictly or solely capital gains to fund their livelihoods or fund into their retirement. They should be paid commensurately. And I kind of push it down the provincial line now as well. They will receive significant funds from the inclusion rate change, which can be directed into their healthcare system. And in fact, on top of that, I was proud to be at the announcement with the Prime Minister and the Premier of Ontario, Premier Ford, where we announced a $3.1 billion agreement with the province of Ontario. And on top of that, the $200 billion 10-year agreement with all the provinces and the bilaterals we've signed with the provinces. That's the real work I believe Canadians want us to see. On this debate, I'm obviously looking at it from I want to get rid of surplus stripping. I want to get rid of tax avoidance strategies that are out there at this current time. We need a system where integration is there. We also need a tax system, and I sat on the Finance Committee from 15 to 19, where we broaden the base, lower the rates, make it efficient, fair, more neutral. And this is, to me, one step in the right direction. I will go to Mr. Cochrane. I believe you're from the CLC, if I'm not correct. And are my comments and sort of on that mark in terms of making the system more neutral and fair with the inclusion rate change?
Yeah, I think this inclusion rate change is absolutely a vital first step. And we're hearing, we've heard from Mr. Stefanik, we've heard from the gentleman from the Wheat Growers Association, and they have legitimate concerns. However, capital gains exclusion is an extremely blunt policy tool if we want to ensure the preservation of family farms, if we want to ensure that small business owners have pensions. If we want to achieve those things, we need to implement policies aimed at achieving those things, not maintaining the capital gains exclusion that sees the vast majority of the benefits go to people like the billionaire that Ms. Brusk mentioned in her opening comments. That billionaire made that $4.5 million tax-free buying shares on the secondary market, selling shares on the secondary market. There was zero productive investment that happened with that. The company that he bought and sold those shares of, over the next 3 years, they repurchased $4.5 billion of their own shares and made about $50 million in net capital investment. So our financial system is not doing the things that it's supposed to be doing. There's lots of changes that need to be made. And this modest change is an important step in the right direction. Of course, there's a lot more hard work ahead of us, and I believe all of you around this table are prepared to do that hard work to achieve it, and we hope that you will talk to the CLC about how we might get this entire financial system to be much fairer than it is.
Barra, are you?
Oh,
yeah.
I thought I was out of time.
You had 35 seconds.
Oh, 35. Oh,
Yeah.
no. I think I did think I was out of time. To CLC President Brusk, what would you like to add to this discussion? You represent 3 million hardworking Canadians.
What I said earlier stands. I'm worried about those folks who don't actually have a pension. When we're talking about utilizing, fair taxation so that folks can actually save money for their retirement so that they can retire with dignity, we have a lot of work to do. That means that we need to be able to have the funds available to help those workers out. And it starts by making sure that we have fair taxation in Canada. This is, again, a modest change that is going to have a significant impact.
Thank you. And now to MP Samari, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you again to Mr. Godbout. I looked at your presentation very closely, and I returned to the 4 issues that you pointed out. One of which was to give a bit more time to taxpayers, say 6 months, to allow them to digest this, but that's not going to be the case. So if I understood, you also spoke to the need for flexibility. If you could explain in detail on paper what this consists of, it would be helpful. Well, let me say that when people make their tax declaration, when they file for 2024, they should have the possibility of saying before June 25th they chose to dispose of certain goods. For example, people who have real estate holdings, that they decided themselves to dispose of a certain amount of their holdings. It's not magic. They would be taxed at about 50% before making their filing. So for 2024, that should apply, and then it could kick in for 25 and beyond. That would be a lot better for people, less stress, fairer. The people would have the time to quickly consult professionals. Thank you. Now, I read the explanation on sites, financial sites, with the changes. They excluded the possibility of integrating this change into the legislation. What do you think about that? Well, I don't know why they excluded it. I believe in it. In 1994 position, the federal government at the time had put such a choice, such an option in place. And people were able, therefore, at that time to, in the spring of 95 until from February 24, to retrospectively do that. Well, I would like to ask you more questions on the elements, but my time is out. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you, Mr. St. Marie.
Thank you. Dr. Stanford, I'd like to talk about an issue that I don't think has been raised at this meeting, and that's the Canadian Entrepreneurs Incentive will reduce the inclusion rate to 33.3% on a lifetime maximum of $2 million in eligible capital gains. Combined with the enhanced lifetime capital gains exemption, when this incentive is fully rolled out, entrepreneurs will have a combined exemption of at least $3.2 million when selling all or part of a business. According to the government figures, entrepreneurs with eligible capital gains of up to $6.25 million will be better off under these changes. Do you have any comment on that particular aspect of the change?
It is important to keep in mind that the existing exemptions under the capital gains tax that we already have, including the principal residence exemption, the lifetime exemption for farms and small businesses, are maintained, and in the farms and small business case expanded. And now this new entrepreneurship credit will provide a lower capital gains inclusion rate than we have at present for that $2 million lifetime. So there's a significant share, probably the strong majority of small businesses that will actually be better off under this reform than they are at present.
Thank you. Final question to Canadians for Tax Fairness. I just want to be clear on this. Mr. Polyev has stated that he argued the reforms, quote, will drive billions of dollars of machines, technology, business, and paychecks out of our country. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we're worried about capital flight, I mean, where I think we're normally worried about that is to the U.S. And so I just note that President Biden's recent budget proposed an even larger increase in the top marginal tax rate on capital gains than this proposal is there. So, and I also think that Canada, has a very skilled workforce and generous tax credits, and so there's a lot of reasons that companies will want to be here, and I don't think this is going to cause a significant exodus.
Thank you, MP Davies. Next, I have MP Morantz, and then I know we'll go a little bit over members. We'll then MP Thompson to finish off this round. MP Morantz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cochrane, you said a few minutes ago that the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate is a blunt instrument, and that I'm paraphrasing, but it's unfortunate that people like Mr. Stefanik and Mr. Yoakum get caught up in it, because the real point of it is to get at the very wealthy high earners that are really in the 0.13%. Would you agree then, is it worth trying in this process we're studying the proposed legislation, is it worth trying to come up with a mechanism to exempt folks like Mr. Stefanik and Mr. Yoakum, so that who are legitimately not part of the 0.13% from having to pay an inclusion rate over and above the 50%?
I don't think it's the appropriate means of making sure they're not paying it. I think we need to take, as best as we can, the Carter Commission's recommendation that you tax all forms of income and then provide other mechanisms to ensure that taxes are being leveled where you want them to be leveled. So provide credits as a means of people reducing their tax burdens, rather than leaving this area of certain forms of income that aren't going to get taxed, which then just entices all kinds of deformations of how people are going to operate to avoid having income that gets taxed at all.
Fair enough, but at the end of the day, I think we're getting to the same place in two different ways. So you would agree that folks like Mr. Stefanik and Mr. Yoakum, who are not legitimately part of the 0.13%, should be made whole and not be penalized the way the high earners would be.
I mean, I don't know their exact financial situations. I'm assuming that they are looking at reasonable gains. It's worth mentioning with regards to the different changes that are going to be made that it's at $6.2 million in capital gains, that once all of the changes are implemented, at $6.2 million, you're going to be paying higher capital gains than under the current rules. So if those gentlemen are looking at more than $6.2 million in capital gains, good for them, but also they have an obligation to pay into our tax system. All people do.
There are people like them who are not part of the 0.13%, who are caught up in this, who are not part of that group. And all I'm asking you to confirm is that you would agree that they shouldn't be taxed at the higher inclusion rate.
I will agree that you have work ahead of you to make sure that our tax system is fairly applied to all Canadians.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Thank you. And now over to MP Thompson, please, for our final questioner.
Thank you. And Dr. Stanford, I'm sorry I referenced you as Mr. Stanford before. My apologies. Some professionals incorporate to obtain generous tax and liability benefits. And there's been criticisms that essentially we're killing working class jobs and even hindering entire sectors as a result of the tax change. Would you give your response to those criticisms, please?
I don't believe that this change in the inclusion rate will have any impact on actual real investment spending by Canadian businesses. Businesses don't buy machinery in order to try and sell it later at a profit. That's where the capital gains issue would be most relevant. And for running and maintaining a profitable business, this change will have no impact. In terms of professionals, there are huge advantages, not just tax advantages, but also issues about protecting liability for the professionals involved. And if they decide that those advantages are no longer relevant, then they can organize their businesses differently. But I doubt very many will do that. They'll still continue to access those benefits of incorporation.
Thank you. And I'm the final speaker, and I'm going to give you the final word. Any closing comments on what you heard today?
Thank you. Again, this is obviously a very passionate debate, but I think it's an important one. It's a long-standing controversy in tax policy that Canada's partial inclusion system was so generous, not just unfair in terms of delivering so much tax advantage to generally very high-income people, but also inefficient in terms of distorting decisions that companies make about corporate structure and stripping cash from businesses in order to take advantage of this loophole. So I think this measure is modest and timely, and I support it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, MP Thompson. We thank our witnesses. I do need to hold the members' attention for a second, and because I do need your approval for something. So the clerk and the chair, I'm asking, would be empowered to publish. We do this every year, a news release to launch the pre-budget consultations process. Request submissions with a provisional deadline for the submissions of briefs of Friday, August 2nd, 2024. Okay. Thank you, members. August 2nd, 2024. Yeah.
Isn't that what is that, a Friday?
It's a Friday, yes.
Friday of a long weekend?
I don't know. Wow. It is Friday of a long weekend, wow. Yes. There you go. Okay, thank you. And MP Davies?
Mr. Chair, did we set any kind of deadline for further witnesses for the resumption of this study in the fall? Or will you send a note around maybe in the summer for when we can get those names in?
Yeah, we have not set a deadline, but we can send something around. Thank you very much, members, and to our witnesses, thank you very much for your testimony. And at this time, we are adjourned.